Hey folks, in the year 1291, the final Crusader stronghold in the Holy Land stood on the edge of doom. A city of knights and merchants, of prayers and steel, Acre. A fortress battered by time, desire, and destiny. A place where empires clashed, where whispers of faith turned into screams of war, and flaming towers fell into the sea like dying stars. For nearly 2 centuries, Crusaders held the dream of Jerusalem alive, but when Acre burned, that dream turned to smoke. This is not just a story of a siege. It is a story of courage and collapse, of ambition and betrayal, of relics lost beneath the waves, and memories that refuse to die. Tonight, on this channel, we open the gates to the past. We will walk the stone halls where knights once prayed, stand on ramparts trembling under Mamluk thunder, dive beneath waves searching for Templar treasure, and feel the heartbeat of a city in its final hour. If you think you know the Crusades, think again. Acre was more than a battlefield. It was the end of an era. This is the fall of Acre, the last dawn of the Crusaders. Acre, or as medieval chroniclers lovingly wrote, Acre, or Saint Jean d'Acre, was not just a city of stone and sea. It was the last breath of Crusader power in the Levant, the final glittering jewel remaining from 2 centuries of blood, devotion, trade, treachery, and miracles. By the late 13th century, Jerusalem was long lost to Islam. Antioch had fallen, Tripoli was gone, Edessa nothing but a memory. Only Acre remained. A fortress city perched like a stubborn relic on the Mediterranean coast, crowded with knights, pilgrims, merchants, relic peddlers, and dreams that were already turning to dust. The wind carried Latin prayers mixed with Arabic curses, the stench of busy harbors, gold coins clinking in Venetian, counting rooms, and the weary sighs of soldiers who had fought too many holy wars. It was a city vibrant yet dying, prosperous yet doomed. A candle still burning though wax had nearly melted down. Christian Europe remembered Acre as the doorway to the Holy Land, the port where kings landed, where crusading banners once fluttered like storms. Richard the Lionheart walked its streets. So did Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, monks, sinners, and everything in between. But by 1291, glory was fading. The Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem existed mostly on parchments and nostalgia. Acre was defended by rival orders more jealous of each other than fearful of the enemy. Feuds ran deep. The Templars in their mighty sea tower, the Hospitallers in their grand complex, Venetians and Genoese plotting trade advantages rather than salvation. Instead of unity, there were arguments in courts, drunken brawls in taverns, and political chess in council chambers. The West promised reinforcements, but ships rarely came. Popes thundered for new crusades, but crowns in Europe were tired, busy with their own wars, debts, and succession disputes. Meanwhile, across the desert, a storm was forming, one more disciplined, determined, and righteous than any Christian army remaining. The Mamluks, warrior slaves turned rulers of Egypt, watched Acre with cold eyes. Their sultans had broken the Mongols at Ain Jalut and driven Crusaders out of nearly every stronghold. To them, Acre was not just a city, it was a thorn in the flesh of Islam, a reminder of humiliation, a foreign colony planted by invaders. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil, son of the mighty Calawan, was determined to purge it forever. Not negotiate, not tolerate, destroy. He knew that if Acre fell, the era of crusades would crumble with it. Symbolically, spiritually, strategically. Every imam, scholar, and warrior in the Islamic world could rally behind that goal. And so, while the Christian factions quarreled and nobles schemed over titles they hardly possessed, Khalil sharpened his sword and prepared an army that would thunder like judgment upon the coast. In early 1291, rumors trickled into Acre, whispers from merchants, scouts returning pale with fear. The Mamluks were gathering. Thousands, tens of thousands, catapults, siege towers, engineers, cavalry like waves of iron. At first, many in Acre dismissed it as rumor. The Latins had survived sieges before, after all. The sea was open, supplies could come. The walls were strong, but beneath the bravado, even the toughest knights felt it. The old world was ending. Some suggested evacuating civilians. Others argued for negotiation. Still others wanted one last holy war. But no consensus came, only time passing like sand through cracked fingers. Each sunset over Acre's harbor seemed more beautiful than the last, as though the city itself knew that its final days were near. As winter faded into spring, the warning signs became impossible to ignore. Caravans from the south reported that the Mamluk Sultanate was mobilizing with an intensity not seen in decades. Blacksmiths in Cairo hammered day and night, shaping blades meant for Frankish throats. Timber was cut in the Nile Delta for siege engines. Messengers galloped between Damascus and Alexandria. From Anatolia, from the deserts of Arabia, from the fertile valleys of the Nile, fighters answered the call of jihad. Chroniclers would later speak of numbers so vast that tents stretched like a sea across the plains, a host determined not for plunder, but for extinction of Crusader presence. Sultan Khalil wanted no treaty, no compromise. He spoke openly, "I will not leave in Acre a single Frank who is not slain or enslaved." His resolve turned the campaign holy. For many Muslim warriors, this was more than conquest. It was closure of centuries. Meanwhile, in Acre, the mood swung between denial and frenzy. Bells rang in churches, calling people to prayer. Heralds shouted for militia musters. Yet even as fear grew, the city did not find unity. Rival merchant republics armed private militias. The Templars and Hospitallers glared across the square like wolves forced into the same cage. The king of Jerusalem, Henry II of Cyprus, stayed mostly in Cyprus, offering limited aid. Appeals were sent to Rome and to European kings, England, France, Aragon. But Europe had moved on. The age of crusades was fading. The romantic fever that once sent peasants marching barefoot toward Jerusalem had cooled into political calculation. France struggled with domestic matters. England was entangled with Scotland in internal rivalries. No great hosts sailed for Venice. Only small contingents trickled in, brave, devout, but far too few. Still, Acre prepared. Engineers strengthened walls. Catapults were positioned atop battlements. Templar and Hospitaller commanders inspected armories, stockpiling arrows, tar, stones for hurling. On the docks, shipwrights repaired vessels in case of evacuation or desperate sorties. Markets thrived unnaturally, as though merchants sensed a last chance to profit from fear. Some families fled early, boarding ships for Cyprus. Others arrived, pilgrims hoping to see the Holy Land before it was too late, or mercenaries seeking coin and glory. The harbor remained noisy, colorful, yet beneath it ran a tension sharp as a drawn blade. Nobody said it aloud, but many wondered, will help come, or are we on our own? Then came the news like thunder. The Mamluk army had set out. Reports spoke of 100,000 soldiers, infantry armored in mail, elite cavalry wielding curved blades, and siege engineers with massive trebuchets capable of hurling stones heavier than a man. The Christians called these giant engines Al-Azab, the tormentors. They could shatter walls thought unbreakable. Along with them marched sappers trained to undermine defenses and miners carrying tools to collapse towers from below. Standards glinted in the sun, green banners of Islam, black banners of elite regiments, gold embroidery capturing verses of the Quran calling for victory. When the Mamluks reached Acre's horizon in April 1291, the sight froze the city's heart. Eyewitnesses wrote of the earth trembling under hooves, of drums like thunder, of tents rising overnight like a second city surrounding the first. Trumpets sounded, but cries echoed. The Crusaders climbed the battlements to watch, pale and silent, as the fate of 2 centuries walked toward them in living waves of steel. Some crossed themselves, others muttered prayers. A few smiled grimly, welcoming a glorious last stand. But everyone knew, history had turned a page. What happened next would either save Christendom's last bastion or erase it forever. Acre's defenses were formidable, the result of decades of construction and expansion. Towering walls ringed the city, double-layered in places, reinforced with stone so massive that even Mongol siege engineers had once failed to breach them. The outer wall, nearest the plains, stood tall with battlements and defensive towers spaced at regular intervals for archers. Behind it rose the inner wall, thicker, higher, built to ensure that even if the first defense fell, the city would still hold. Massive gates, St. Anthony's Gate, the King's Gate, the Accursed Tower, watched the approaches like stern guardians. Moats were deep, barbican strong. At sea, the Templar fortress loomed on its own promontory, a near island connected by a narrow causeway. To many, it seemed unconquerable. Inside these walls, Acre was a world unto itself. Loud, crowded, multicultural. Latin priests marched in ceremonial robes, while Muslim traders haggled in back alleys. Jewish scholars discussed scripture by lamplight. Armenian craftsmen carved wood and stone. Taverns overflowed with sailors singing in half a dozen languages. The scent of spiced wine and roasting meat drifted through narrow streets, mingling with incense from churches and the salty breeze of the harbor. Knights and mail walked past barefoot pilgrims. Children chased dogs near the marketplace, unaware of history preparing to crush their world. Every morning the sun rose on a scene vibrant with life. Every night torches flickered on golden mosaics and stained glass, illuminating hope that maybe, just maybe, Acre would survive. But beyond the walls, the Mamluk army tightened its grip. Engineers measured distances. Siege towers began to rise, wooden skeletons growing taller each day. Trenches were dug to protect archers. Trebuchets were assembled carefully, like monstrous alchemies of rope, timber, and iron. Each swing of a hammer was a countdown. The Crusaders launched sorties, small cavalry raids meant to disrupt construction, but success was fleeting. The enemy line was vast and disciplined. Every slain scout was replaced. Every setback answered with redoubled effort. And every morning, when the defenders looked out, the siege engines stood closer, larger, more terrible. Inside the city, leadership fractured. Some nobles urged negotiation. Perhaps tribute could buy time. Others spat at the idea, calling negotiation cowardice. The Templars refused compromise entirely, swearing that Acre would stand or fall in the name of Christ. The Hospitallers agreed, but grew frustrated by lack of cooperation among secular lords. The Patriarch called for unity, fasting, prayer. Yet behind closed doors, accusations flew. Who had provoked the Mamluks? Who failed to send pleas to Europe earlier? Who would command when battle began? The city council devolved into arguments. Voices rose. Hands went to sword hilts. In those tense halls, the real enemy was not yet the army outside, but the disunity within. And in the shadows, ordinary citizens listened, fear spreading like smoke in a dry room. Still, there were moments of strange normalcy. On calm evenings, families gathered on rooftops watching the red sunset bleed across the sea. Minstrels played lutes in taverns, as though music might drown the marching drums beyond the walls. Lovers met in hidden gardens, promising to flee together if the worst came, though many knew deep inside there might be no escape when siege lines closed. Priests preached bravery. Knights inspected armor. Arrows were fletched by lantern light. Mothers baked bread for sons who would hold spears on the parapet soon. Life continued, both stubborn and fragile, like a flame flickering against an oncoming storm. And then, one morning, before dawn fully broke, a hush fell on the city. From the plains, horns blew, long, rumbling, foreboding. Drums rolled like thunder. The Mamluk banners rippled as ranks formed with military precision. Trebuchets creaked into readiness. Their great arms pulled back like the string of a divine bow. On Acre's walls, defenders gripped their weapons and stared out into the half-light. The world seemed to inhale, one long breath suspended between peace and annihilation. For more than 200 years, Crusader kingdoms had risen and fallen in the Holy Land. Now everything came down to this moment. The last fortress, the last hope, the last stand. When the sun finally rose on that fateful morning in April 1291, Acre awoke not to the sound of merchants calling or church bells welcoming the day, but to a thunderous crack that shook the city like an earthquake. A massive stone, launched from a Mamluk trebuchet, arched through the sky, so slow it seemed almost graceful, before slamming into the outer wall with a deafening roar. Dust burst like smoke, men stumbled, children screamed. A second stone followed, then a third, until the air was filled with the terrifying rhythm of siege artillery, each impact a drumbeat of approaching doom. The defenders scrambled into position. Archers ran along battlements. Knights mounted horses for counterattacks, and priests hurried with relics, blessing the frightened and the brave alike. The siege of Acre had truly begun. The Mamluks coordinated their assault with methodical precision. Their siege lines stretched around the landward side in a deadly arc, tower shields protecting sappers, archers adjusting to fire upward into crenellations, cavalry waiting to chase any who dared sally forth. Their great trebuchets, some named the Victorious, the Demolisher, the Fury of Islam, worked in relentless harmony, flinging stones, burning oil jars, and sometimes even bodies of dead soldiers to spread disease and terror. The Crusaders retaliated with their own engines. On the walls, counterweight trebuchets called mangonels hurled return fire into enemy camps. One well-aimed shot smashed through a Mamluk trebuchet arm, snapping like a twig. Cheers erupted, hope flickering, but hope was a fragile resource, easily drowned beneath waves of reality. Inside Acre, the mood shifted instantly from anxious anticipation to survival. Marketplace stalls were abandoned. Fishermen grabbed spears instead of nets. Women carried water to defenders, tended the wounded, or hid with children in basements as stones shook houses to their foundations. The wealthy packed valuables or bribed ship captains for a place should the walls fall. Yet many common folk could only pray. No ship waited for them. No escape existed. For them, the city itself was a final coffin or a final crown. At council, leaders finally showed unity, but unity born of desperation. The Templar Master, the Hospitaller Grand Master, and other nobles agreed to defend the walls at all costs. Scouts proposed night raids to destroy trebuchets. Priests encouraged a procession carrying the true cross fragment to strengthen morale. Chroniclers noted that even long-feuding factions now stood shoulder to shoulder, staring at a future stained with fire. War had burned away hesitation. Now only willpower remained. And so, for days and nights without rest, Acre endured a rain of stone and flame. Every crack in the wall was patched with timber, earth, or bodies of fallen defenders. Every fallen tower was reinforced with barricades. And every death was answered with another warrior taking his place. The Crusaders knew one truth. If Acre fell, Christendom's last sanctuary in the east would fall with it. The fight was not merely for a city. It was for memory, for identity, for 2 centuries of dreams written in blood. Despite the terrifying power of the Mamluk war machines, the Crusaders were far from passive victims. On the 3rd night of the siege, under the cover of moonless darkness, elite Templar and Hospitaller knights gathered at the gate of St. Anthony, faces grim behind steel helms, swords silent in their sheaths. The plan was bold: strike hard at the Mamluk trenches, burn their siege engines, and retreat before sunrise. Priests whispered final blessings. Men crossed themselves. Then the gate groaned open, and like a torrent the knights surged into the night, their blackened armor blending with shadows, hooves beating like wildfire across the plain. Behind them followed infantry with torches and flasks of oil. The attack was a shock. Mamluk guards barely had time to cry warning before iron crashed into shields. The charge was unstoppable. The first lines broke like water. Franks set fire to a half-constructed siege tower, flames climbing greedily toward the sky. Several trebuchets were damaged. Engineers cut down where they stood. Curved blades met straight swords in brutal clashes. Shield edges splintered, horses screamed, sparks flew bright as falling stars. The knights withdrew just before encirclement, riding back through the gates battered but triumphant. The city roared with pride, believing perhaps God favored them still. Yet such victories came with heavy costs. Dozens of knights lay dead. Good horses, irreplaceable in siege, were slain. And though some engines burned, the Mamluks rebuilt them by next evening. Their manpower seemed endless, their determination absolute. For every Frankish sword, a dozen Mamluk spears waited. Still, the Crusaders fought like lions. Greek firepots were hurled from walls, splashing flames across enemy lines. Archers practiced deadly discipline. Some could shoot 6 arrows a minute, raining shafts like wasps into advancing formations. The Genoese fleet in the harbor armed ballistae to fire at siege towers creeping forward. Every street behind the walls was reinforced with barricades. Civilians helped dig trenches, carry ammunition, or nurse the wounded with herbs and wine. The whole city had become a fortress within a fortress. But even the strongest wall erodes under constant storm. After nearly 3 weeks, cracks widened. One tower partially collapsed under repeated bombardment. Defenders scrambled to build an inner barricade of rubble and wood. In some sectors, Mamluk archers gained positions close enough to pick off soldiers on battlements with terrifying precision. Quivers emptied faster than they could be filled. The defenders fought with exhaustion carved in their faces. Eyes sunken, armor dented, hands blistered from bowstrings. Yet morale remained strangely resilient. Songs were still sung softly at night. Knights swore oaths to die before surrender. Mothers comforted children. Promising angels guarded the walls. And even those who doubted kept their despair silent, fearing that one breath of hopelessness might break the city's spirit more effectively than any trebuchet. But time was no ally. The Mamluk army was tightening like an iron serpent, and Christian relief, if coming at all, would arrive too little, too late. As supplies ran low and fatigue dug deep wounds into Acre's heart, hope flickered when a cry went up from the harbor, ships approaching from Cyprus. Sailors shouted, citizens ran to the docks, spirits igniting like lantern fire. The fleet brought several hundred men, knights, crossbowmen, mercenaries, and some desperately needed supplies. Not an army capable of lifting the siege, but enough to stiffen resolve. Among them strode King Henry II himself, crowned yet powerless, returning to a kingdom now reduced to one besieged city. Though his presence inspired morale, his forces were too few to change the balance. The people welcomed him nonetheless. In dark times, even symbols of leadership mattered. The fresh troops joined the walls where fighting was fiercest. Their arrival delayed collapse, but also lengthened suffering, for more mouths required more food. Grain stocks dwindled, wells were strained. The constant pounding of trebuchets made sleep a luxury. Some whispered of breaking out by sea, evacuating women and children. The Templars vehemently opposed any retreat, calling it betrayal to abandon God's last foothold. The city council argued bitterly, yet every debate circled back to the same truth. Escape was nearly impossible, and surrender meant massacre or slavery. Outside the walls, the Mamluks advanced their lines closer still. Siege towers rolled forward on reinforced wheels protected with rawhide soaked to resist fire. Shielded sappers dug tunnels beneath towers to collapse fortifications. Every day, the horizon darkened with more soldiers, more machines. Sultan Khalil himself rode along the lines, a figure of authority in gleaming armor, urging his men with promises of reward and promises of judgment for failure. Chroniclers described his eyes as hard as polished onyx, fixed upon Acre like a hawk watching dying prey. The defenders prayed for a miracle. Rome sent words of encouragement, but no armies. Europe's kings were busy fighting each other, not the infidel. In a cruel twist of history, Christendom's warriors killed fellow Christians in continental wars, while Islam united for a single purpose: to purge the Crusaders forever. Yet in Acre streets, life still clung stubbornly. Blacksmiths worked without rest repairing dented armor. Bakers rationed bread. Children carried arrows up steps to battlements. Women washed blood from stones where battles raged. The city had become a single living organism, every hand helping, every heart pounding the same rhythm. Survive. But survival is a coin with limited shine. Each day the bombardment intensified. Towers trembled. Walls shivered like old bones. The Mamluks were close now. So close defenders could hear laughter from their camps, hear prayers from their imams before battle. Clouds of dust hung over Acre like a funeral shroud. As May 1291 advanced, Acre trembled beneath the ceaseless rain of stones. Sunrise no longer meant renewal. It meant new bombardment, new breaches to repair, new funerals to mourn. The once beautiful skyline of churches, merchant houses, and golden-roofed halls now sprouted scars. Roof tiles shattered like eggs under falling rock. Towers lost crenellations and stood jagged like broken teeth against the sky. Smoke often rose from fires sparked by incendiary payloads. Still, defenders worked tirelessly, passing buckets of water, sand, and earth in human chains to extinguish flames. The rhythm of war became routine. Impact, dust, screams, repairs, repeated endlessly. Yet even in despair, the people found strange resilience. Priests led processions through the streets, relics held high, splinters of the true cross, bones of saints, while chanting Deus Vult. Some said they saw miracles, arrows bouncing harmlessly from icons, wounded soldiers standing after hearing sacred hymns. Others whispered that angels walked the ramparts at night. Whether truth or desperate imagination, these stories fueled courage. Faith was a lifeline, the only shield against crushing fear. But for many, fear still crept like cold fingers into the soul. Mothers clutched their children, wondering if they would live to see another dawn. Merchants counted coins pointlessly. Wealth meant nothing if the city burned. Rumors spread that Mamluks had sworn to kill every Christian they found. Men sharpened swords with trembling hands. Women hid heirlooms beneath floorboards, hoping someday they might be found by survivors, if any survived at all. The air was heavy with conflicting emotions, hope that a miracle might come, and dread that fate was already sealed. On the battlements, knights stood vigilant. They spoke quietly, sharing stories of past campaigns. Hattin, Jaffa, Damietta, battles won and lost, brothers buried. Veteran warriors knew the signs. A long siege like this rarely ended well for defenders. Supplies dwindled faster than walls could be repaired. Some knights wondered if evacuation by night might save a portion of the population, but pride and duty forbade them from voicing such thoughts aloud. Yet fear can also forge unity. Rivalries between Templars, Hospitallers, Venetians, and Genoese began to fade, not from love, but necessity. When a trebuchet strike collapsed a section of outer wall near the accursed tower, both orders rushed together to fill the breach with stones, beams, and overturned wagons. Men who once refused to drink from the same tavern now shed blood side by side. The city council held frantic meetings, voices hoarse, eyes red from exhaustion. Every decision bore weight measured in lives. Outside the walls, the Mamluks tightened their siege lines further. Scouts reported new engines arriving daily. Tents of fresh troops appeared like mushrooms after rain. Drums echoed at dawn and dusk, reminding the Christians that the enemy was patient, confident, prepared for the long grind. Sultan Khalil watched from a raised pavilion, inlaid with carpets and silk, observing Acre like a judge deciding sentence on a condemned soul. To his commanders, he issued simple orders: do not stop. Hammer them until they break. And so the hammering continued. The ground shook constantly. Dust coated everything: bread, water, hair, skin. People breathed war. Children grew silent, wide-eyed, their innocence stripped by terror. At night, the groans of the wounded mixed with distant war chants. The moon highlighted broken walls like bones of a dying beast. Acre was bleeding, not dead yet, but weakening. All knew. Soon the Mamluks would storm the walls. When that moment came, the city's fate would balance on a blade's edge. Victory through impossible valor, or annihilation remembered for centuries. On May 18th, after weeks of relentless siege, the inevitable happened. A section of the outer wall near the gate of St. Anthony, already cracked, trembling, patched countless times, finally gave way under the combined assault of multiple trebuchets. A massive projectile struck with a thunderclap, followed instantly by another. Stones exploded, dust rose like a volcanic cloud, and with a slow, mournful groan, the wall collapsed inward, tons of masonry crashing down, burying men beneath rubble. Screams pierced the chaos. The defenders rushed to fill the gap, but before they could stabilize it, horns blared from the Mamluk lines. The assault began. Thousands surged forward, shield bearers first, forming a turtle shell wall against arrows. Behind them rushed sappers carrying hooks and ladders, followed by elite infantry roaring battle cries. Arrows from Acre rained down like angry hail, yet the mass advanced undeterred. Crossbow bolts struck shield rims, spear tips glinted, drums thundered. The defenders met them at the breach with ferocity. Templars standing shoulder to shoulder, swords drawn, white mantles stained with dust and blood. Hospitallers joined beside them, black cloaks whipping in the wind. Common soldiers wielded axes, pikes, even kitchen knives, anything to halt the flood. The fighting at the breach was hell incarnate. Men slipped on rubble slick with blood. Shield met shield in crushing impact. Blades flashed like lightning in tight quarters. Every inch of ground was paid in lives. A knight toppled from the edge, speared midair. Mamluk archers found deadly angles, picking targets with hawk precision. Yet the Crusaders countered with crossbows firing point blank, bolts punching through lamellar armor. Some threw burning pitch, others unleashed boiling oil. The air filled with screams, smoke, and the metallic tang of iron and blood. For hours, the breach seesawed, gained, lost, regained, bodies forming macabre mounds. Above, banners of the cross and crescent fluttered in a deadly contest. The city's bells rang without pause, summoning every able-bodied soul to defend. Priests on rooftops raised crucifixes high. Shouting prayers over the den, women carried water through rain of arrows. Some struck down while still clutching jugs. Youths barely old enough to hold swords thrust them blindly, hands shaking. Just when it seemed the defenders might be overwhelmed, a charge of heavy cavalry burst through the inner gate. Knights on armored horses storming into the breach with earth-shaking momentum. The shock drove the Mamluks back, buying precious time. Acre roared in triumph as the enemy retreated, dragging wounded behind them. The wall was in ruins, but still the city stood. However, it was victory in name only. The breach remained open. Repairs were nearly impossible under constant fire. Worse, the Mamluks had tasted access. They now knew the walls could fall. That night, Acre shivered beneath new bombardment, more intense than before. Stones fell like meteors, shaking houses to foundations. Fires erupted in several districts, citizens forming desperate bucket lines. Sleep was forgotten. In council, panic rose. Some urged immediate evacuation by sea. Others insisted reinforcements might still arrive. The Templars swore to defend to the last, refusing any talk of surrender. The Hospitallers agreed, though with somber realism. Many nobles argued the city should attempt negotiation, but the Sultan had already rejected such proposals. To him, the Crusaders were intruders in Muslim land. He sought not treaty, but erasure. As dawn approached, a grim truth settled over Acre. The next assault would be the last, and it would not stop until either the Mamluks were repelled, or every defender lay dead. Night of May 19th was unlike any Acre had known. Instead of the usual din of taverns, music, or trade, the streets echoed with prayers and whispers. Torches flickered in windows where families gathered for what many felt was a final meal. Bread was broken, wine shared, tears shed quietly. Parents told children stories of saints and miracles, hoping faith could soften fear. Some wrote letters or last wills, hiding them under stones or placing them in church vaults. Others walked the ramparts silently, as if memorizing every brick of the city they loved. In the great churches, St. Cross, St. John, the Cathedral of the Holy Sepulchre, crowds knelt shoulder to shoulder. Candles burned like constellations in shadowed naves. Priests led chants of Kyrie eleison, Lord have mercy, voices trembling but strong. Bells rang deep into the night. Relics were placed at gates and walls, believed to protect against the storm to come. Some beggars confessed sins openly, seeking peace before death. Others, driven mad by fear, accused neighbors of cowardice or betrayal. But most clung to hope, thin and fragile as candle flame. Meanwhile, on the walls, soldiers sharpened blades, repaired armor, tightened bowstrings. Crossbowmen inspected quarrels carefully. Each shot must count. Knights rubbed fatigue from their eyes, knowing dawn would demand every ounce of strength. The Templar Master William of Beaujeu rode along the battlements, speaking calm words to weary men. The Hospitaller Grand Master Jean de Villiers, wounded yet unyielding, vowed to fight even if carried on stretcher. Their courage spread like fire in cold hearts. Outside, the Mamluk camp blazed with activity. Torches dotted the plains like stars fallen to earth. Siege towers rolled into final position, taller than walls now weakened. Trebuchets creaked as counterweights were tested. Horses snorted, armor clinked, drums beat slow and ominous. From the enemy camp rose voices in unison, reciting Quran, chanting prayers, calling for victory over infidels. To listeners on Acre's walls, it sounded like thunder from heaven. But some Christians found strange comfort. If the enemy prayed as fiercely as they did, then the coming battle was more than conquest. It was destiny meeting destiny. Near midnight, a temporary cease of bombardment fell. A surreal silence spread over Acre. One could hear waves lapping against harbor walls, wind sighing through broken towers, distant murmurs of men preparing to die. Lovers shared last embraces. Friends clasped hands wordlessly. For a few hours, war paused, and humanity breathed. But dawn was inevitable. At the first pale light of May 20th, horns exploded across the plain. The ground shook beneath marching feet. Siege engines rolled forward. Banners unfurled, green, black, gold, gleaming in morning sun. The Mamluk army advanced like an unstoppable tide, chanting as one voice. Acre's bells answered, ringing wildly. Knights mounted horses. Archers raced to parapets. Women passed water in bolts. Priests raised crosses. Children hid beneath altars. The fate of Acre and the Crusades will be determined today. At dawn on May 20th, 1291, the world over Acre seemed to ignite with fury. The first rays of sunlight glinted off thousands of helmets and spearheads as the Mamluk army surged forward with terrifying purpose. Siege towers rolled like wooden giants toward the wounded walls. Trebuchets that had hammered the city for weeks now shifted fire deeper inside, hurling stones and incendiaries into crowded streets to prevent defenders from regrouping. War drums pounded, horns blared, and a roar rose from the plains. Tens of thousands of voices chanting the takbir, Allahu Akbar, a sound that shook even the bravest Crusaders. It was not merely an army attacking, but a civilization come to erase another. The defenders rushed to their positions. Templars took the most vulnerable sectors, especially the Great Breach near St. Anthony's Gate, where rubble still lay fresh from the previous day's collapse. Hospitallers guarded the inner stairways leading to the city's heart, shields ready to interlock. Genoese and Venetian crossbowmen lined the parapets, quarrels knocked, eyes sharp. Priests moved among them, raising crucifixes, chanting Deus Vult, as if words alone could hold back the tide. The sound of Latin chants clashed with Arabic war cries, merging into a haunting symphony of faith and desperation. The Mamluk vanguard struck like a spear. Shield bearers advanced in tight formation, raising pavises to deflect arrows. Behind them came engineers with hooks to pull down remaining stones, ladders to scale walls, axes to hack barricades. Arrows darkened the sky, a deadly rain from both sides. Some shafts thudded into wooden shields, others found flesh. A Hospitaller knight staggered back with 3 arrows in his chest, but refused to fall, swinging his sword wildly until another took his place. Blood began to slick the rubble as the first wave clashed at the breach. For a moment, a brief, blazing moment, Acre held. Crossbow bolts punched through Mamluk lamellar armor. Greek fire pots burst among attackers, flames crawling hungrily over cloth and skin. Knights charged downhill into the breach, lances lowered, smashing into enemy ranks with brutal force. The ground beneath them became a churned mix of mud, stone, and bodies, but still they fought. Chroniclers later spoke of that hour as one of the most heroic stands in Crusader history. Outnumbered 10-1, the defenders fought with fury born of desperation, knowing there was no retreat, no reinforcement, no second chance. But heroism alone cannot conquer exhaustion. Many defenders had gone days without real sleep. Arms shook from strain, eyes burned with dust and smoke. Mamluk reserves poured forward relentlessly. Whenever one warrior fell, another stepped over him. Siege engines loomed close now, towers so tall that their platforms nearly matched the wall's height. Archers atop them fired downward into defenders from angles previously unreachable. One tower reached the battlements, its drawbridge slamming down with a thunderous crack. Mamluk swordsmen surged through the gap like water bursting a dam. A new battle ignited atop the walls themselves. Fierce, intimate, brutal. Steel rang against steel. Men grappled, bit kicked, stabbed. A Templar and a Mamluk officer locked swords, sparks flying, until both plunged from the parapet locked in death's grip. Another defender, wounded and cornered, hurled himself off the wall rather than be taken. Yet still others rushed to replace them, unwilling to abandon ground even as it crumbled beneath their feet. Acre's warriors fought like martyrs, every heartbeat purchased in blood. Still, the Mamluks pressed closer. More towers docked, more ladders rose. The breach widened, arrows ran low. For every one Christian on the wall, 10 Muslims surged below. The defenders were magnificent, but magnificence cannot rewrite fate. The wall line was bending. Soon it would break. By midday, the situation had turned dire. The breach could no longer be contained. Mamluk infantry poured through like a flood set loose. The defenders fell back from the broken wall to inner barricades. Makeshift defenses of wagons, barrels, timbers, even household furniture dragged from homes. The fighting spilled from battlements to streets, alleys, market squares. Acre was no longer a city. It became a labyrinth of war. Every corner a kill zone, every doorway a shield, every rooftop a potential sniper nest. The Templars made a stand near the accursed tower, forming an iron wedge to slow the advance. Hospitallers guarded the hospital quarter, protecting civilians sheltering behind them. The king and nobles attempted to form reserve units near the convent of the Poor Clares, hoping to counterattack. But discipline fractured under chaos. Horn blasts signaled retreat, advance, rally, sometimes overlapping, confusion rippling through exhausted soldiers. Still they fought. In the marketplace, Mamluk soldiers surged forward, only to meet Genoese crossbowmen firing from upper windows. Bolts struck down officers, halting momentum. In reply, Muslim archers shot flaming arrows into rooftops. Houses burned, smoke billowing into the sky, ash falling like snow. Women ran with buckets, children crying behind them, but fires spread relentlessly. Once vibrant streets of merchants and pilgrims became rivers of flame and blood. Near the church of St. Andrew, a group of Crusader knights charged on horseback through a wider street, an attempt to relieve pressure on overrun sections. Their charge cut through several waves, scattering foot soldiers. but the streets of Acre twisted unpredictably. Dead ends and narrow alleys trapped mounts. From windows above, Mamluk archers rained arrows into the cavalry, and soon the noble horses fell, leaving knights fighting on foot once more, surrounded. Every district became a story of defiance. At one barricade, townsfolk armed only with knives and hammers held back attackers for nearly an hour. A blacksmith forged makeshift spearheads from iron scraps, handing them out still hot. A teenage boy climbed a bell tower to signal troop movements with a horn until an arrow silenced him. Even monks joined battle, some with swords, others with nothing but wooden staves and scripture on their lips. But valor could not halt inevitability. The Mamluks advanced methodically, street by street. Each defense cost more Christian lives than Muslim. Tenacity slowed the enemy, but could not break them. Sultan Khalil commanded reserves forward, urging them to take the city before nightfall. His generals obeyed, pushing ruthlessly. By mid-afternoon, several districts had fallen. Survivors fled toward the harbor and inner fortresses. The Templars regrouped at their sea tower, transforming it into last refuge. Hospitallers consolidated near their fortified quarter, covering the escape of wounded and civilians. Everywhere, retreating soldiers shouted for aid, but reinforcements were dwindling fast. Many knights had already fallen. Others were surrounded, cut down, or captured. The defenders' last hope was to hold long enough for ships to evacuate survivors. But the harbor was chaos. Civilians swarmed the docks, begging for passage. Sailors struggled to push boats off, while soldiers tried to keep order. Some ships left half empty in panic. Others overloaded and capsized. Priests tried calming crowds with prayer, but fear was stronger than faith in those moments. Still, some ships managed to sail. Crying families climbed aboard, leaving behind husbands, fathers, brothers who chose, or were forced to remain and fight. Many knights refused evacuation, believing honor demanded death over flight. Some nobles attempted escape, but many failed to reach the docks through encroaching enemy lines. Acre was dying piece by piece. Yet in its dying, it fought with such monstrous courage that even Mamluk chroniclers later wrote with respect. The Crusaders fought like lions in a burning cage, but flame burns flesh, no matter how brave. Night approached, and with night the end. As shadows stretched across Acre in the late hours of May 20th, the defenders gathered for the final stand. The outer city was lost. Only the last fortresses remained. The Templar headquarters near the harbor stood like a stone island amid a sea of death. The Hospitaller quarter, though battered, still held a defensive perimeter. Between them, the streets ran crimson, corpses of knights and civilians alike. Flames rose in pillars, casting an apocalyptic glow over the waters where surviving ships fled westward. Inside the Templar stronghold, Master William of Beaujeu, grave, armored, yet weary, prepared his men for inevitable breach. Earlier that day, he had been struck by a lance, the wound bleeding beneath mail. When asked to retreat, he famously replied, "I am not running. I am dead already." With that, he returned to the battlements, fighting until collapse. His fall demoralized many, but his defiance lit a final spark in others. Knights vowed to fight around his banner until they themselves fell. Meanwhile, the Hospitallers fortified the convent of St. Anthony and all surrounding structures. Jean de Villiers, though wounded in previous battles, refused to leave. He rallied his brothers. "Brethren, today we dine with martyrs." They understood. There would be no sunrise for them unless through miracle or legend. The Mamluks pressed on relentlessly. Siege ladders rose against the temple walls. Mangonels pounded gate after gate. The defenders hurled stones, boiling oil, even furniture upon attackers. Some women climbed the parapets to throw pots, tiles, burning rags, whatever could kill or slow advance. Children carried water to the wounded, refusing to abandon fathers. In those final hours, rank meant nothing. Every soul was a soldier. Inside the Hospitaller quarter, a corridor defense formed. narrow alleys channeling attackers into choke points where spears and crossbows reaped heavy casualties. For a while it worked. Piles of enemy bodies filled gateways. But the Mamluks brought sappers with picks, undermining walls that could not be reinforced quickly enough. Explosions of stone signaled new breaches. Fresh troops replaced every fallen one. The Crusaders, bleeding and exhausted, could not replace their dead. As night deepened, fires spread uncontrolled. The sky glowed red. Smoke blurred the stars. Screams echoed like tormented ghosts. Some defenders prayed. Others fought silently, rage replacing fear. A few tried to break through enemy lines toward the harbor, but streets were choked with Mamluks by now. The city had become a trap with only one direction, toward final stand. By midnight, the hospitaller defenses cracked. The convent fell after brutal melee. Monks slaughtered where they stood. Jean de Villiers was carried away by brothers toward the harbor, half alive, refusing to abandon his men until they physically dragged him. A handful of hospitallers escaped by boat. Most died covering retreat. Only the Templar fortress remained. It towered over a harbor thick with smoke and desperate refugees. Its walls were strong, perhaps unbreachable. If any place in Acre could hold beyond collapse, it was this. Hundreds, maybe thousands, knights, soldiers, civilians, rushed inside as gates slammed shut. Children cried for fathers lost outside. Women collapsed from exhaustion. Bloodied knights leaned against walls, knowing they would defend this stone tomb to the last breath. Across the water, ships departed into darkness, carrying survivors towards Cyprus. Those left behind stared into flame-lit night with hollow eyes. The city was gone. Only the fortress remained. Tomorrow, it too would fall. After the fall of the inner city, the mighty Templar fortress became the last bastion of Christendom in the Holy Land. It stood at the edge of the harbor like a stubborn giant of stone, its massive walls rising from the sea itself. Built not merely as a fort, but as a symbol of the Templar Order's power, it had endured countless storms, raids, and sieges through a century of conflict. Thick walls, multiple layers of defense, underground storehouses, and a direct sea gate made it one of the most impregnable structures in the East. Now, however, it was less a war citadel and more a lifeboat of doomed souls. Thousands, knights, infantry, merchants, priests, women, children, crowded inside. Rooms meant for strategic councils now held families huddled in fear. Corridors where Templars once walked with disciplined silence echoed with cries, hurried prayers, clashing metal. Supplies were limited. Water barrels were guarded closely. The wounded lay in rows, groaning softly, tended by monks and sisters who worked until hands trembled with exhaustion. Some still believed they might hold out until a relieving fleet came from Cyprus. Others were too weary for hope, knowing no army was coming. Acre was on its own. Outside, the Mamluks surrounded the fortress, lanterns glowing like a constellation across the dark shoreline. Their commanders were determined to crush the last resistance. Yet even they respected the Templars enough to approach cautiously. The fortress had survived massive bombardment, and now its defenders prepared for a siege within a siege. Inside, the Templar leadership gathered in the central hall. With Master Boju dead, authority passed to Thibaut Gaudin, a man known for both piety and calm resolve. He addressed the assembly, his voice steady despite thunder of siege engines outside. Brothers, we stand at the edge of history. This tower is the last candle of the cross in the east. If it must be extinguished, let it burn bright until the final breath. Knights answered with a solemn roar, striking swords against shields. No one talked of surrender. Not yet. Even as Acre burned around them, the Templar oath held firm. Poverty, chastity, obedience, and defense of the faith until death. Many had taken vows expecting martyrdom. Now fate offered it. Throughout the night, defenders manned parapets, watching the enemy like wolves circling a wounded stag. Mamluk sappers built new bridges, filled moats with rubble, dragged siege towers closer. Archers harassed any movement on the walls. Drums beat through the night, like a funeral heartbeat. From inside, one could hear faint cries from the dying city. Fires snapping, collapsing roofs, distant sobs of those trapped in ruins. Yet in the fortress, life clung stubbornly. Mothers told children's stories of Jerusalem, shining beneath Crusader banners long ago. Knights sharpened swords while whispering prayers. A priest recited psalms over soldiers preparing for likely death. One young squire, barely 15, tied his first white mantle, trembling but determined to fight as a Templar, even if only for one day. Sometimes courage is not a roar. It is a whisper in the dark saying, "Not yet." Morning of May 21st saw new developments. Sultan Khalil, eager to end resistance without further bloodshed, sent envoys to the fortress. They offered terms: lay down arms, leave the fortress, convert or accept captivity, and lives might be spared. It was a calculated move, crush pride before storming walls. Exhausted civilians begged the knights to accept, desperate for hope. But the Templars knew better. Stories of massacres in other conquered cities, Tripoli, Antioch, were fresh memories. They had seen what happened to prisoners when walls fell. Mercy in war was unpredictable, promises often bent like reeds. And the Mamluks despised the Templars more than any other order. These warrior monks had been thorns in Islam's side for 2 centuries, fierce in battle, unyielding in crusade. The Sultan's offer felt like bait. Still, Thibaut Gaudin sent negotiators, more to stall than surrender. Talks continued hours, but trust was thin as thread. Civilians pleaded for safe passage by sea. The Sultan agreed reluctantly to allow non-combatants to depart in exchange for the fortress itself. For a brief moment, hope flickered. Boats began ferrying civilians from the fortress to remaining ships offshore. Women, children, elderly, priests, they left with tears and prayers, watching Acre's burning skyline like a nightmare they would never forget. Some knights escorted them to docks, then returned to the fortress, choosing to stay behind. Honor over life, their creed, now fulfilled in painful clarity. But fate intervened cruelly. During evacuation, a quarrel broke out between Mamluk soldiers guarding the landing area and some Templars escorting civilians. Accounts differ. Some say a soldier insulted a knight, others that greed over valuables sparked a clash. Either way, blood spilled. One Mamluk was killed, then another. In an instant, trust shattered. Chaos erupted. Mamluk reinforcements charged. Knights retreated, civilians screamed. Boats shoved off too quickly, some overloaded, capsizing in a harbor. Others were seized. Many who might have escaped fell beneath blades or drowned beneath waves. The Sultan was enraged. Negotiations ended violently. Mercy evaporated. Now only annihilation remained. Siege engines roared again, focusing fire on the fortress itself. Hours of bombardment fractured outer walls. Massive stones slammed into towers, shaking foundations. The defenders countered with ballista bolts and boiling oil, but munitions grew scarce. Wounded knights bandaged arms with torn mantles. Corpses were dragged to inner halls to clear fighting space. Outside, the Mamluks prepared the final assault. Elite Mamluks with axes, Nubian archers with deadly aim, siege engineers with battering rams. Drums thundered through smoke-filled air. The fortress trembled like a dying beast. The defenders prayed, knowing time was short. Thibaut Gaudin made a final decision. The Templar treasure, holy relics, gold reserves, must not fall to the enemy. Under cover of night, he slipped aboard a small ship with a handful of knights, charged with safeguarding the Order's legacy. It was not cowardice, it was duty. Someone had to survive to rebuild the Order beyond the sea. The rest, the majority, remained behind, knowing they fought not for victory now, but for memory. Their fate was sealed. At dawn, the Mamluks launched their ultimate assault on the Templar fortress. Siege towers rolled forward under cover of thousands of archers. Catapults hurled boulders that shook the very bedrock. One strike shattered a corner of the outer wall, opening a fresh crack. Through this breach surged elite infantry, black-clad Mamluks wielding curved sabers. shouting war cries that echoed across the harbor like thunder. The Templars met them with a countercharge, few in number, but fighting like men possessed by holy fire. Battle raged through corridors and hallways. Every staircase became a choke point, defenders fighting step by step, blood splattering stone. Knights pushed enemies back with shields, swords flashing like silver flame. Some fought from horseback in the courtyard, lance tips piercing armor. When lances broke, they took up maces, axes, even banner poles. Every fallen brother was replaced by another until ranks grew thin as threads. The Mamluks breached one hall after another. Inner walls collapsed. Smoke clouded vision. Yet the fortress still held, stones soaked in blood but unbroken. In desperation, Mamluk sappers placed explosives beneath supporting pillars. The earth shook as partial sections collapsed, burying attackers and defenders alike in dust and ruin. When daylight waned, only the sea tower remained. It rose directly from waves, connected by a narrow bridge. Inside it, the last surviving Templars, around 100 by some accounts, fortified themselves for a final stand. Survivors were gaunt, armor dented, eyes haunted, yet spirits like burning coals. They refused surrender. They refused conversion. They would fight until death opened its gate. The Sultan, furious at repeated delay, demanded the tower's destruction. Engineers undermined foundations while ships approached from seaside with archers firing at slit windows. Stones rained from above, waves crashed below, screams filled the salt-thick air. The tower swayed, groaned, cracked, but endured. The Templars prayed aloud, voices ragged. Non nobis, Domine, non nobis, sed nomini tua da gloriam. Not unto us, O Lord, but to your name give glory. As evening fell, undermining tunnels reached deep beneath the tower pillars. Sappers lit charges. Moments later, a thunderous explosion split the night. The great tower shuddered, tilted like a wounded giant, and with a roar that seemed to shake heaven itself, the last bastion of the Crusades collapsed into the sea, taking knights and attackers with it. Water swallowed stone and bodies alike. Witnesses later claimed they saw white mantles floating like ghosts on the waves. The survivors of the fortress, very few, were captured or killed. No more defense remained. The Crescent now ruled Acre. The age of Crusades had ended, not with retreat, but with heroic death. Acre fell. Jerusalem's last daughter was gone. The Holy Land belonged once more to Islam. And with that collapse, an era of 2 centuries, Crusaders, kingdoms, relics, holy wars, closed like a book heavy with blood. The sun rose over Acre on the morning after its fall, but its light brought no life, only revealed the terrible scars of the night before. Where once stood a bustling Mediterranean jewel, now lay a smoking grave. Streets were buried beneath broken masonry, bodies, shattered shields, and torn banners. Fires smoldered among collapsed roofs. Ash drifted like gray snow across the ruins. The harbor, once crowded with merchant vessels and Crusader galleys, was littered with burnt ships, drifting wreckage, and floating corpses and armor. The sea had become a cemetery. Mamluk soldiers roamed through the ruins as grim victors. Some searched for survivors, others looted valuables, gold crosses, silks, jewels, relics stripped from churches. Captives were herded in chains. Men, women, children too slow to escape. Some resisted and were cut down where they stood. Many noble women were spared but enslaved, marched toward Damascus or Cairo as trophies. Young boys were taken for soldiery or servitude. Priests were often executed, considered symbols of the Crusader faith. Chroniclers wrote of screams that echoed for hours after the battle had ended, lingering like ghosts over the broken city. Yet not all Mamluks behaved with barbarity. Islamic law encouraged protection of the innocent, and some commanders enforced order, preventing wanton slaughter. The Sultan himself wished to showcase a decisive victory, not an uncontrollable massacre. But war is chaos. When walls fall, control dissolves. Hatred built through generations unleashed itself brutally. For many Muslim warriors, this was vengeance for 200 years of Frankish occupation, revenge for Jerusalem's sack, for slaughtered Muslims in 1099, for countless battles of the past. Acre was where accounts were settled. In the great cathedral, once filled with holy hymns, now lay shattered stained glass, broken icons, toppled altars. Mamluk officers inspected relics, some taken as diplomatic gifts, others destroyed as symbols of conquest. Bells were silenced forever. In streets where Crusader children once played, now only smoke drifted and carrion birds circled overhead. The silence of loss was louder than any siege. But even amid ruin, strange pockets of life persisted. In cellars and tunnels beneath the city, some families hid for days, emerging only when hunger forced them into open. Some were captured, others fled at night, along shorelines or swam desperately toward distant ships. A few Templars survived by hiding among debris, later escaping after dark by boat. Their accounts preserved memories of Acre's fall with harrowing clarity. Sultan Khalil entered the city in triumph, escorted by commanders bearing black and gold banners. He rode through the ruins of St. Anthony's Gate, where so much blood had been shed, and declared the Crusader presence in the Holy Land ended. The call to prayer sounded from makeshift towers, echoing through burnt streets where church bells once dominated dawn. History had turned. The crescent replaced the cross. Acre had fallen, but its story was not yet finished. For what followed would shape memory, religion, and identity across 2 continents for centuries. News of Acre's fall spread like wildfire across the Mediterranean. Messengers reached Cyprus within days. The survivors who had escaped carried the tale in broken voices. Acre is lost. The last city has fallen. Bells tolled in Nicosia and Famagusta, not with celebration, but mourning. Crowds gathered weeping in churches, praying for souls left behind. Nobles read the reports with shock. Generals stared blankly, knowing what it meant. There would be no Crusader stronghold left in the east. No port to launch expeditions. No foothold to reclaim Jerusalem. The dream of the Holy Land had died. When word reached Rome, the Pope collapsed in a prayer. Chroniclers say he wept openly, grieving not only for the dead, but for the shattering of Christendom's centuries-long mission. Papal letters called for a new crusade, urging kings and princes to avenge Acre. But Europe was weary. France and England were entangled in wars soon to ignite into the 100 Years' War. Spain focused on Reconquista. German princes squabbled. Italy warred with itself. No great army marched east. Calls for crusade rang like an echo in an empty hall, loud but powerless. For the Islamic world, however, Acre's fall was a moment of triumphant unity. Mosques from Cairo to Damascus overflowed with worshippers giving thanks. Poets celebrated the victory in verse. Scholars declared a sign of divine favor. The Mamluks, once seen as usurpers, slave warriors who overthrew their masters, now stood as protectors of Islam. Sultan Khalil was hailed as a hero greater than Saladin by some. Yet pride mixed with warning. If Crusaders had come once, they might come again. The coasts were fortified, guard towers built where churches once stood. But the threat never returned with the same strength. The Mediterranean world changed overnight. Merchant networks rerouted trade. Pilgrims journeyed instead to Rome, Santiago, or local shrines. Orders of knights, Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic brothers reconsidered their purpose now that they no longer defended territory in the Holy Land. Some moved their headquarters, others sought new missions. The Templars, richest and most secretive, would soon face suspicion from European kings. Accused of heresy, crushed, dissolved. The Hospitallers survived longer, relocating first to Cyprus, then Rhodes, then Malta. The Teutonic Knights turned north, warring in the Baltic. The fall of Acre did not simply end the Crusades. It redirected the currents of history. Europe turned inward, then outward toward the Atlantic. Exploration would eventually replace crusade as its driving force. Meanwhile, the Middle East consolidated under powerful dynasties, building Islamic architecture where Crusader castles once cast shadows. Yet the memory of Acre lingered like a scar. Knights spoke of lost comrades in taverns. Priests preached sermons of sacrifice. Bards sung tragic ballads of doomed courage, of Templars fighting to last breath at the sea tower, of mothers fleeing with children, of banners burning in final light. And in the East, families told stories of ancestors who reclaimed the holy coast from invaders. Acre became legend, two sides of one sword. The fall of Acre in 1291 was more than a military defeat. It was a full stop on a century-spanning chapter of world history. For nearly 200 years, Crusaders had crossed the sea driven by faith, greed, adventure, or penance. They built kingdoms, sacked cities, forged alliances with local lords, fought with Muslims, Jews, even other Christians. They left behind castles on cliffs, roads across hills, ruins and deserts. But by 1291, those kingdoms existed only in memory. Acre's collapse was the extinguishing of the final flame. Symbolically, Acre was the last heartbeat of the Crusader states. When it fell, so did the idea that Latin Christendom could permanently control Jerusalem. The Holy Sepulchre remained in Muslim hands. Pilgrims still traveled there, but as guests, not rulers. The dream that every knight and priest held when the First Crusade was called in 1095, the dream of eternal Christian dominion over the Holy Land, died among the rubble of Acre's walls. Yet endings are also beginnings. The Crusades' failure forced Europe to rethink identity. Without Eastern conquest to unite them, kingdoms turned ambition westward. Across the Atlantic centuries later, Spanish and Portuguese explorers would seek new worlds for glory, wealth, and Christianity. In this way, the Crusades indirectly birthed age of exploration, colonization, and empires. A wave ended, but another rose. For the Islamic world, victory over Acre strengthened cultural and political confidence. The Mamluks proved that no foreign warrior could hold dominion forever. They built madrasas, mosques, markets across reclaimed lands. Trade flourished through eastern ports again. Scholars studied medicine, astronomy, mathematics, fields that would later travel back to Europe through contact and translation. The clash of Cross and Crescent did not only produce war, it also exchanged knowledge. But perhaps the most powerful legacy of Acre lies in memory. Across centuries, historians and novelists returned to its story. Filmmakers, poets, and painters recreated scenes of last stands, tragic valor, burning towers. Some portrayed Crusaders as noble heroes, others as brutal invaders. Some saw Mamluks as righteous defenders, others as fierce conquerors. The truth is complex. Acre was not black or white. It was blood, faith, betrayal, courage, greed, sacrifice, destiny. In Acre's fall, we see the end of medieval crusading and the dawn of a different world. The cross no longer ruled Levantine shores. The Mediterranean shifted focus. But the memory persisted, sung in taverns, prayed in churches, whispered in mosques. It remains today a symbol of endings that reshape civilizations. And though the city fell in ruin, its story still stands, stronger than walls, brighter than banners, carried on in chronicles, archaeology, and imagination. Acre died, but history remembered. The fall of Acre in 1291 was not a single-day tragedy, but the outcome of decades of fractures, errors, and rivalries among the Crusader states. The city did not fail merely because of the strength of the Mamluk army. It failed because those who defended it were never truly won. This disunity was not sudden. It was woven into the Crusader presence in the Holy Land from the beginning. By the late 13th century, it had become a gaping wound that no number of swords could mend. Inside Acre's walls lived a chaotic diversity. Templars, Hospitallers, Teutonic Knights, Italian merchant republics like Genoa, Venice, and Pisa, nobles from France, England, Germany, Aragon, pilgrims from across Europe, native Christians, Syrians, Armenians, and Muslim merchants under truce. In theory, this was a melting pot of opportunities. In practice, it was a powder keg. Rival orders distrusted one another more than they feared distant sultans. Venice and Genoa often fought naval battles in Acre's own harbor, at times burning each other's ships while Muslims watched the spectacle with amusement or relief. The religious military orders themselves often acted like independent governments. The Templars, wealthy and influential, answered only to the Pope. The Hospitallers ran hospitals and fortresses, but were also fierce warriors. Their rivalry could be deadly. Council meetings to decide city policies routinely devolved into insults, threats, even brawls. When Mamluk envoys sought negotiation or trade agreements, they used this disunity as leverage, playing factions against each other while strengthening their own position. Even when Acre became the last Crusader foothold, unity did not magically appear. Some nobles wanted peace to protect trade. Others demanded war to reclaim Jerusalem. The arrival of new Crusaders from Europe sometimes destabilized the fragile order. Young knights sought glory through reckless raids, provoking retaliation from Muslim neighbors. One such incident shortly before siege, an attack by newly arrived Frankish mercenaries on Muslim caravans, angered Sultan Khalil and arguably accelerated the decision to destroy Acre completely. There were moments when unity glimmered, like during early siege days when orders fought side by side. But such solidarity was born of desperation, not planned strategy. The truth was bitter. Acre was defended by brave men, but not by one people. They were fragments of armies, fragments of nations, fragments of faith. Meanwhile, outside the walls stood a single, united force under one command, fueled by shared purpose, to end the Crusader era once and for all. History often turns not on strength of arm alone, but on strength of unity. Acre lacked it when needed most. Acre's fate was sealed long before the siege began. For years, one city after another had fallen to Mamluk advances, each loss tightening a noose around the remaining Crusader territory. To understand Acre's collapse, we must see the domino trail behind it. After Saladin's retaking of Jerusalem in 1187, Crusaders lost much of their Holy Land foundation. The Third Crusade recaptured coastal cities like Acre, Jaffa, and Tyre, but never reclaimed the Holy City itself. What remained became thin coastal strips dependent on European reinforcements and fragile truces. As decades passed, these states weakened. The Mongol invasions briefly disrupted Muslim power, giving Crusaders false hope. But once Mamluks defeated the Mongols at Ain Jalut in 1260, they redirected their full strength toward cleansing the coast. City by city, fortress by fortress, they fell. 1244, Jerusalem lost permanently. 1265, Caesarea falls. 1266, Saif captured. 1268, Jaffa and Antioch fall. 1275 to 1289, Latakia and Tripoli collapse. 1291, Acre stands alone. Each loss reduced Crusader manpower, resources, and morale. Refugees crowded Acre, swelling population beyond sustainable capacity. Trade declined as ports fell, cutting economic veins. Castles, once lines of defense, became isolated islands doomed one by one. The Mamluks were methodical, not impulsive. Their long strategy resembled the steady pressure of a glacier, slow, unstoppable. Europe, meanwhile, shifted focus. Crusader kings died or feuded. Successive crusades were poorly organized or diverted elsewhere, like the Fourth Crusade, attacking Christian Constantinople instead of Muslim-held Jerusalem. Later attempts were small, underfunded, or redirected to North Africa. The once mighty wave of soldiers crossing the Mediterranean shrank to trickles, irregular and insufficient. By 1291, Acre was not the heart of the kingdom. It was the last leaf on a dead branch. Without surrounding fortresses, its defense relied on ships alone, and even naval support was not guaranteed. A single breach became fatal because there was no depth behind the walls. No second city to retreat to, no safe land passage, no reinforcements walking from inland strongholds. Acre stood like a candle in a storm with no shelter. The Mamluk strategy was clear: isolate, surround, suffocate. When they finally marched on Acre, they brought with them not only soldiers, but engineers, siege masters, ladders, towers, and supply lines built through years of conquest. The defenders, though courageous, were simply overwhelmed by mathematics. More enemy troops, more siege equipment, more patience. It was not failure of bravery, but failure of long-term strategy. Acre fell not merely in May 1291. It had been falling step by step for decades before that day. Even as Acre prepared for its final battle, Europe was already a world transformed. The age that birthed the First Crusade was gone. Popes no longer held unquestioned authority. Kings no longer rushed to Jerusalem with full armies at a single holy call. The values, economics, and political landscapes had changed. In the 11th and 12th centuries, crusading was a path to salvation and glory. Knights sought redemption for sins by spilling enemy blood. Peasants joined pilgrim armies believing God himself marched with them. The idea of reclaiming Jerusalem electrified kingdoms. But by the late 13th century, Europe had bled through multiple crusades. Tens of thousands never returned. Families lost generations. Kingdoms spent fortunes. And the Holy City remained unrecovered. Fatigue settled like frost. Meanwhile, Europe discovered new priorities. France and England eyed each other with suspicion. Conflict soon exploding into the Hundred Years' War. Italian city-states fought for trade dominance rather than Crusader unity. Germany fractured into feuding principalities. Spain and Portugal focused on fighting wars at home, not sailing east. The papacy still preached crusade, but enthusiasm cooled. No king could spare enough men or treasure to challenge the Mamluks. Even when news of Acre's siege reached Europe, responses were delayed or symbolic. A few hundred knights arrived, not thousands. Had a massive army landed early in the siege, outcome might differ. But history is not written by perhaps. On the Islamic side, unity also evolved. Once fractured among Fatimids, Ayyubids, Abbasids, and regional warlords, the Middle East consolidated. The Mamluks, once enslaved warriors, became the shield of Islam. Their military machine was efficient, experienced, and deeply motivated. They viewed Crusaders not just as enemies, but as invaders who had violated holy lands. The struggle was not only political, it was spiritual. Every victory fueled morale. Every loss to Crusaders long remembered. By 1291, their resolve was hardened into iron. Trade further complicated matters. Italian merchants profited from commerce with Egypt and Syria, selling weapons, timbers, and goods even during Crusader times. War and trade existed side by side like strange bedfellows. Some merchants feared that a strong crusading movement would harm profitable relations. Money, as always, could outweigh ideology. By the final siege, Acre stood as relic of a fading age, a symbol rather than a stronghold. Each side fought for legacy as much as land. Crusaders fought for memory of Jerusalem, Mamluks for restoration of Islamic dignity. The clash was inevitable. One of them had to fall, and the tide of history favored the East. Thus, Acre fell because the world around it changed. Those who built the Crusader dream were no longer alive. Those who inherited it lacked numbers, support, or unity. The Mamluks struck at the precise moment when Crusader flame flickered weakest. When the final tower fell, it was not only stones collapsing, it was the end of an era. Much of what we know about the Siege of Acre comes from voices that survived. Chroniclers, monks, soldiers, merchants, and even Muslim historians who observed the fall with pride or awe. Their testimonies transformed the siege from mere historical narrative into a living memory, filled with screams, prayers, dust, and fire. Through them, we stand on battlements, smell burning pitch, hear death's footsteps closer each hour. One such voice is Theobald, a Templar knight, who wrote shortly before dying in the final days. His letters, preserved later in archives, describe exhaustion so deep swords felt heavier by each heartbeat. He writes of watching friends fall beside him, of carrying water to walls while arrows hissed overhead, of moments where courage wavered and only faith forced knees to remain steady. He writes, "The sky was black with stones, the air with cries. Yet I swear, in that hour, God walked among us. We were not afraid to die, only to fail." His words tear through centuries, showing us not abstract warriors, but flesh and blood men, trembling yet unbroken. Another witness, a woman known only as Marguerite, left an account preserved in a convent after escaping to Cyprus. She speaks not in grand strategy, but in everyday horror, hiding her children in a cellar as walls shook like thunder, praying while flames devoured the street outside. She describes seeing hospitalers dragging wounded back from collapsed towers, their armor dented, faces streaked with soot and tears. One detail stands clear. They fought like angels in armor. I had never seen men so broken in body yet so fierce in will. Her memory shows us siege not from ramparts, but from homes crumbling one by one. Muslim chroniclers also wrote, and their words reveal the other side of the battle. Ibn al-Furad, writing in Cairo, describes the Mamluk camp preparing siege engines with scientific precision, archers practicing for hours, imams reciting encouragement. He praises Sultan Khalil's resolve to end Crusader presence forever. To him, Acre's fall was divine recompense for past humiliation. God granted us victory over the unbelievers. Their towers fell like rotten trees before the righteous. His pride reflects generations of struggle. Another historian, Baybars al-Mansuri, who likely witnessed events firsthand, admires Crusader bravery even as he condemns them as invaders. He records fierce fighting near the breach, saying enemy knights fought like lions whose den is aflame. He even notes that many Mamluks wondered how such a small garrison resisted so long. Respect born from battle. Not all accounts came from educated men. Some are short, anonymous. Monks who scribbled hastily while city burned outside, ship captains who wrote logs while ferrying refugees, young squires who described last stand in shaky handwriting. Yet through every testimony we see the same truth. Acre's final days were chaos, courage, terror intertwined. Voices of the siege remind us that history is never silent. It speaks through memory. Imagine a scribe in Cyprus years later, hunched over parchment, copying fading letters from survivors. Ink stains his fingers, candle burns low, and the sound of waves carries whispers of a city long gone. Through such scribes, much of Acre survives not in stone, but in words. One such letter, written by Brother Matthew, a hospitaler medic, recounts tending wounded for 3 nights without rest. He writes of blood pooling on monastery floors, of arrowheads embedded like metallic thorns in skin, of men delirious with pain calling for mothers long dead. His letter ends, "If God spares me memory, I shall never forget the screams under falling walls." His trauma echoes centuries later. Another record comes from Niccolò of Genoa, a merchant trapped inside Acre during siege. His diary reveals panic among civilians, not cowardice, but helplessness. He describes running through burning streets with his wife and daughter, clutching a sack of coins worthless among fire. He saw a knight collapse beside cathedral steps, blood-soaking cloak like spilled wine. Niccolò managed to board a ship, but writes, "I heard the city die behind me. No gold could silence that sound." He carried guilt into old age. From France comes preserved poetry attributed to Blanche of Montreuil, who lost her brother in Acre. Her lament reads, "He fell on stones washed red by dawn, his sword a broken ray of sun." Her grief demonstrates how Acre's fall traveled far, breaking hearts in distant lands that never smelled Levantine salt air. Meanwhile in Damascus, a clerk describes celebrations, but also exhaustion. Victors mourned friends killed scaling walls. Mothers wept for sons buried far from home. War spares none completely. Even triumph carries shadow. Another Muslim account remembers seeing Templar bodies floating near collapsed tower, white cloaks upon black waves, ghosts of stubborn men. An image haunting in its stark contrast. Through letters and chronicles, we witness not only battle, but humanity, the hungry, the wounded, the praying, the hopeless, the defiant. These writings lift siege from cold history into breathing reality. When we read them, Acre rises again, not as ruins but alive with sound, movement, fear, sword clashes, ashes falling like snow. We hear mothers whisper prayers. We hear banners snap in wind. We hear siege engines groan. We hear final breaths. Language becomes time travel. The fall of Acre planted seeds in both worlds. Seeds of pride, grief, warning, and legend. To Christians, it became a symbol of tragic heroism. To Muslims, a symbol of divine reclamation. Both sides immortalized it through stories passed across generations. In Christian Europe, sermons used Acre as moral lesson. Preachers said faith had weakened, Crusaders sinned, God withdrew protection. Others said Europe abandoned brothers in East, letting last defenders bleed alone. Knights told tales of comrades dying in shining valor, backs to walls, refusing surrender. Children grew hearing ballads of Templars fighting atop a sinking tower like saints of steel. Bards told of ghosts haunting Acre's waves, whispering Latin hymns at night. In medieval art, painters depicted last stand dramatically. Crusaders illuminated by holy glow, enemy armies dark and countless. Reality was not so simple, yet symbolism made truth powerful. Acre became myth as much as memory, a lesson carved in regret. In Islamic tradition, Acre symbolized triumph over centuries of foreign invasion. Poets compared victory to sunrise after long winter. Scholars cited Quranic verses fulfilled through patience and unity. Storytellers praised Mamluk warriors who scaled walls under rain of fire. They told children how ancestors reclaimed coast for Islam, how minarets replaced church towers, how call to prayer echoed where Crusader bells fell silent. Acre became proof that steadfast faith could overcome iron and stone. In both worlds, Acre became more than a city. It became a mirror reflecting identity. To Christians, a warning of disunity, arrogance, and neglect. To Muslims, affirmation of strength and endurance in faith. Legends grew. Some spoke of hidden treasure beneath fallen Templar Tower. Others believed relics lost at sea would surface one day when last night returns. Fishermen told of strange lights under waves during storms, souls of drowned warriors glimmering like candles. Such folklore reveals how deeply Acre imprinted imagination. Centuries later, during Ottoman times, travelers wandered ruins of Acre's walls, sensing ancient sorrow and wind. Crusader stones still lay scattered, some reused in houses and mosques, carrying silent memory. Napoleon, centuries after fall, besieged Acre and failed, an ironic echo of Crusader struggle reversed. He called it the little city that stopped an empire. Even today, Acre, Akko/Aka, stands, layers of history fused like sediment. Crusader halls beneath shops, Mamluk arches above tunnels, Ottoman palaces over ancient stone. Tourists walk where knights bled and merchants bargained. Salt wind carries whispers of 1291 to every curious ear. Acre's memory proves the siege never fully ended. It continues in story, stone, and spirit. When Acre fell, the Knights Templar, once the most feared and wealthy order in Christendom, faced an identity crisis unlike any in their history. For almost 2 centuries, they were guardians of pilgrims, keepers of castles, bankers of kings, and warriors armored in religious zeal. Their headquarters had stood proudly in Jerusalem, then in Acre after Jerusalem's loss. But with the fall of 1291, the mighty order became homeless. The surviving brothers regrouped in Cyprus, battered but not broken. They brought treasure, relics, and the memory of comrades swallowed by the sea tower. Many arrived with haunted eyes, armor still stained with blood from Acre streets. Some wept openly when speaking of Last Stand. Others stared silently, unable to speak at all. Yet even in defeat, Templar pride endured. They planned new crusades, rebuilt ships, trained fresh recruits. Hope flickered, small but persistent. Yet Europe had changed. Kings no longer saw glory in crusading. They saw debts, politics, power. The Templars controlled vast wealth and estates across Europe. Land, grain, horses, gold, banking networks. Their independence made monarchs uneasy. The French king Philip IV, drowning in debt to the Templars, envied their riches. With Acre gone, the Templars' original purpose weakened. Philip saw an opportunity. Rumors spread. Whispers of secret rituals, forbidden oaths, heresy. Truth mattered little. Accusation was a weapon. In 1307, the king struck. Templar leaders were arrested across France at dawn. Their assets seized. Under torture, confessions were extracted. False, but politically useful. Pope Clement V, pressured by Philip, dissolved the order in 1312. The once invincible brotherhood vanished from official record, but not from legend. Many Templars fled to Scotland, Portugal, or into secrecy. Some merged with other orders. Others became farmers or wanderers. Some died protesting innocence, burned at stake. Their fall remains one of history's great tragedies and mysteries. How defenders of Acre became victims of political greed. Yet the spirit of Acre lived on in their legacy. Templar myths flourished. Hidden treasure, secret bloodlines, guardians of Holy Grail. The order became legend, a ghostly symbol of fallen Crusader glory. In a way, Acre was both their final battlefield and beginning of mythic immortality. The Templars died in courts and prisons, but they never died in memory. Their story, like Acre's, lives in whispers, books, films, conspiracies, and ruins. Unlike their Templar brothers, the Knights Hospitaller survived Acre's fall with structure intact. Though they suffered horrific losses, including Grand Master Jean de Villiers being wounded during Final Stand, their mission evolved. The Hospitallers were not just warriors, they were healers. Their vow began not with conquest, but with care for the sick and poor. This dual identity gave them flexibility needed for survival. After Acre, the Hospitallers retreated to Cyprus. There they established hospitals for refugees and reorganized military resources. They inspected what remained of their navy. War galleys damaged and escaped, sails torn by flaming arrows. They forged new swords, trained new knights, studied naval warfare. The sea, not the land, would become their battlefield. By 1310, they conquered Rhodes, transforming the island into fortress state, resisting Islamic fleets. Stone walls rose along coastlines, harbors fortified with chains and towers. For 2 centuries, Rhodes became bastion of Christian defense, launching counter-raids, protecting pilgrims, challenging Ottoman might. Their navy patrolled Aegean like crusaders on waves instead of sand. Hospitallers changed with time. They wore same 8-pointed cross, same vows, same brotherhood, but strategy adapted. No longer defending Jerusalem's walls, they defended Mediterranean routes. Their hospitals grew sophisticated, treating plague, battlefield wounds, diseases with remarkable cleanliness for medieval era. Some scholars argue Hospitallers advanced medical knowledge during this period significantly. But time never stands still. In 1522, Rhodes fell to Suleiman the Magnificent, after heroic defense, echoing Acre's courage centuries earlier. Yet again, Hospitallers retreated, not broken, only displaced. They sailed to Malta, establishing new stronghold in 1530 granted by Holy Roman Emperor. There, they built fortresses that shocked invaders, including victory against Ottoman siege in 1565, one of the most dramatic battles in Mediterranean history. The order eventually transformed into the Knights of Malta, still existing today as a sovereign humanitarian body. Their work in modern hospitals, charity, and aid missions across world carries legacy of Acre's defenders in living form. Through them, Crusader spirits survived not in swords, but in service. Acre fell, but from its ashes the Hospitallers adapted, evolved, lived. The Teutonic Order, younger than Templars and Hospitallers, was deeply affected by Acre's fall, but unlike the others, their destiny lay not in Middle East, but in the north. When their strongholds in the Holy Land crumbled, they turned toward Baltic, where pagan Prussians, Lithuanians, Livonians had not yet converted to Christianity. There, Teutonic knights forged a new crusade, one of ice, forests, and snow instead of sand and date palms. Their fortress castles rose like white teeth across Baltic landscape. Marienburg, Königsberg, Riga. They fought fierce wars, subjugating tribes through sword and cross.